The storm rolled in at dusk, a quiet rumble of thunder vibrating through the air. Olivia sat by the window, watching the rain streak the glass like tears. It had been one of those days where everything felt slightly off. A forgotten appointment, her cat pacing the floor as though it had lost something, the peculiar way her reflection seemed to linger in the mirror even after she turned away. She chalked it up to the weather. Storms always did strange things to her, rattling some internal balance she could never quite explain. Still, as she sipped her tea, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The sensation was faint, but insistent, like a whisper she couldn't quite catch. It was close to midnight when the headlights appeared. At first, she thought it was a neighbor pulling into their driveway, but the beam swept past her house, cutting through the rain. A sleek black SUV crept down her street, followed by another, and then another. They slowed as they reached her home, the vehicles eerily silent as they lined the curb like dark sentinels. Olivia froze, her breath catching in her throat. Who comes visiting this late, especially in this weather? The SUV's tinted windows gleamed under the streetlights, revealing nothing of the occupants inside. The engines idled low, a soft purr that filled the quiet night. Her phone was on the counter, but as Olivia reached for it, the power went out. Darkness swallowed the room, and she heard herself gasp. Rain hammered against the roof, and in the sudden quiet, the sound of a car door opening cut through the night like a gunshot. Someone was coming. The shadowy figure moved with purpose, a large umbrella shielding their head as they approached the front door. There was no hesitation, no tentative knock, just the loud mechanical clunk of the doorbell. Olivia's fingers trembled as she unlocked her phone, the screen casting an eerie glow across her face. She hovered over the emergency dial button but hesitated. What would she say? The man outside hadn't done anything yet, and the police were notoriously slow in her small town. Another ring, then a third, this time more insistent. "Miss Olivia," came a muffled voice, calm and authoritative. "We know you're inside. Please open the door." Her stomach twisted. How did they know her name? She crept toward the window, careful to keep out of sight, and peeked through the curtain. The man stood on the porch, flanked by two more figures who waited by the SUVs, their faces shadowed under wide-brimmed hats. The voice came again, sharper this time. "You can make this easy, or we can make it difficult. Either way, you're coming with us." Something in his tone chilled her to the bone, a note of certainty that suggested he already knew how this night would end. As Olivia stood frozen, debating her next move, the front door clicked open. She hadn't unlocked it. The man stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking softly against the hardwood floor. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening for her. "You've been hiding in plain sight for years, Miss Olivia. But we've been watching. We know what you can do." Her breath hitched. How could they possibly know? She hadn't used her abilities in months, not since the last time things had gotten out of control, not since the accident. She took a step back, and the floor creaked beneath her. The man's head snapped toward the sound, and his lips curved into a cold, thin smile. "There you are." The world had changed. Or maybe it was just her. The black SUV hurtled down an empty road, rain streaking the windows as though the night itself were crying. Olivia sat stiffly in the back seat, flanked by two silent agents whose presence felt more like a threat than a reassurance. Across from her sat Agent Bishop, the man who had stepped into her house as though he owned it. He had introduced himself during the drive, his voice calm and clipped, but she hadn't responded. Every word out of his mouth felt rehearsed, polished to perfection. "You're going to do great things, Olivia," he said now, his piercing gaze never leaving hers. "You've been given a gift. It's time you learned how to use it." "I don't want to use it," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Her throat felt dry, like all the moisture had been sucked out of the air. His smile didn't waver. It's not about what you want. It's about what's necessary. The SUV pulled into a facility surrounded by towering fences and floodlights that made the rain glisten like shards of glass. Olivia's stomach churned as the gate slid open, the vehicle creeping into the heart of the compound. The walls loomed over her, gray and lifeless, stretching endlessly in every direction. It was a place built for control, not comfort. Inside, the starkness was even worse. White walls, white floors, white light that seemed to strip the world of color. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, sharp and sterile. Bishop led her down a series of hallways, his shoes clicking against the polished tiles. Every door they passed had a small window, but the glass was frosted, hiding whatever lay beyond. When they reached a room at the end of the corridor, he stopped and turned to face her. "This will be your home for a while." He pushed the door open, revealing a chamber dominated by a single chair surrounded by machines she couldn't name. Wires dangled from the ceiling like metallic vines, and a screen on the wall displayed a pulsating red dot. "This is where we'll help you refine your abilities," Bishop said, his tone betraying none of the dread that coiled in Olivia's stomach. "You'll learn control, precision, and power." Olivia didn't move. Her legs felt like lead. The room radiated a quiet menace, as though it were alive and waiting for her to step inside. Bishop leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "It's not fear you're feeling," he said softly. "It's possibility." The door shut behind her with a soft hiss, sealing her fate. The room was a trap disguised as a sanctuary. Every surface gleamed sterile and white, reflecting the stark overhead lights in a way that made Olivia's head ache. The machines hummed softly, their blinking lights a silent chorus of vigilance. She sat in the chair at the center of the room, wires attached to her temples and wrists. Each pulse of the electrodes was meant to coax her powers into action, to train her, to tame her. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the world, but it was impossible. Bishop's voice came through the speakers in the ceiling, calm and clinical. "Focus, Olivia. Feel the weight of the object. Imagine moving it with your mind." In front of her, a steel cube sat on a pedestal. It was no larger than a shoebox, but it might as well have been a mountain. Her powers had always come in bursts, unpredictable and chaotic. Asking them to obey her felt like asking the wind to stop blowing. "You can do it," Bishop said. His tone carried a faint undercurrent of impatience, but Olivia sensed something else lurking there too. Excitement. Like he was waiting for her to crack open a forbidden door. The room grew hotter. Or maybe it was her. A faint tingling crept along her fingertips, a pressure building behind her eyes. The cube wobbled once, then stilled. Olivia exhaled shakily. "Good," Bishop said. Again. She clenched her fists. This wasn't right. Nothing about this place was right. The air felt too thick, the silence too deliberate, like a predator lying in wait. And then there was the way the walls seemed to close in on her when no one was watching, as if they were alive. That night, lying on the narrow cot in her dormitory, Olivia replayed the day's events in her mind. She had felt powerful, yes, but also out of control. Like something inside her was uncoiling, a wild animal stretching its legs after years in a cage. She rolled over, staring at the ceiling. It was just as blank and featureless as everything else in this place. No windows, no clocks. Time here was meaningless. That's when she saw it, a faint shimmer at the edge of her vision, a crack in the facade. Olivia sat up, heart pounding. On the wall near her bed, someone had scratched a message into the paint. The letters were jagged and uneven, as though carved in haste. "They will break you. Don't let them." Her pulse quickened. Who had left this? And why? She leaned closer, running her fingers over the grooves. They were old, the edges worn smooth by time. Whoever had written this was long gone. Or worse. The next day, Olivia scanned the facility for more signs of rebellion. She kept her eyes sharp, her questions hidden. In the training room, her gaze lingered on the frost-covered corners of the ceiling, wondering if the cameras watched her every move. In the cafeteria, she noticed how the other recruits, if she could call them that, avoided her eyes, their faces masks of exhaustion. It was in the hallway that she found her second clue. She had lingered behind the group after training, pretending to tie her shoe, when she noticed another message scratched into the metal wall near the baseboard. "They want to use you. Be ready to fight back." The words filled her with equal parts hope and dread. Someone had been here before. Someone like her. Someone who had seen through the lies. But where were they now? And what did they mean by fight back? When she returned to her dormitory that evening, Olivia stared at her reflection in the small mirror above the sink. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken from lack of sleep. But behind the fatigue, she saw something else. Something sharp and unyielding. Resolve. The moment it happened, Olivia knew she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. It started with a simple exercise. Bishop had placed her in a different room this time, one with walls that seemed to hum with their own energy. The steel cube was back, but now there were smaller objects scattered around it. A glass marble, a paperclip, a silver spoon. "Today, we test your control," Bishop said over the intercom. "Move the marble without disturbing anything else." Olivia stared at the marble. She was getting better at focusing, at channeling her power into precise actions. But today, something felt wrong. The room buzzed with tension, as though it anticipated her failure. Her hands began to tremble, the tingling in her fingers growing into a sharp ache. The marble wobbled, spun, then shot off the pedestal, hitting the spoon and sending it clattering to the floor. "Stop," Bishop ordered, his voice clipped. But Olivia couldn't. The power surged through her, unstoppable and wild. The air around her seemed to vibrate, the walls trembling faintly. One by one, the objects on the pedestal began to rise, spinning in a slow, deliberate circle. The lights flickered. "Olivia," Bishop said, louder now. "Stand down." She tried to stop. She tried to push the energy back, to bury it where it had come from, but it was too late. The machines sparked, their screens blinking erratically. The room grew colder, the lights dimming until only a faint red glow remained. And then, the steel cube, solid and unyielding, began to crack. Bishop's voice came again, but it was distant, as though muffled by water. Olivia barely heard him over the sound of her own heartbeat, a deafening drumbeat that matched the pulse of her power. The cube exploded, shards flying in every direction. But instead of hitting the walls, they hovered in midair, suspended by an invisible force. Olivia gasped, the energy within her finally snapping, receding like a tide. When she opened her eyes, the room was still. The shards of the cube floated gently to the floor. Bishop's voice crackled over the intercom, cold and sharp. "Interesting," he said. "Very interesting." Olivia sank to her knees, trembling. She had shown him too much. She had let him see the full extent of what she could do. And now, she knew without a doubt, he wouldn't stop until he'd taken everything. The walls of the facility seemed to breathe, the hum of machinery growing louder with each passing moment. Olivia sat in her dormitory, staring at the scratched message on the wall. "They will break you. Don't let them." The words had become her anchor, a silent rebellion etched into the fabric of this place. But tonight, they felt more like a challenge, a dare to finally take control of her fate. The air was suffocating, heavy with a sense of inevitability. After the incident in the testing room, Olivia hadn't been allowed to train again. She was confined to her quarters, watched constantly by the frosted glass eye of the camera in the corner. Yet even in this cage, she could feel the facility's pulse, the steady thrum of its hidden machinery reverberating through the walls like a heartbeat. They were preparing something. She could feel it. That night, as the lights dimmed for simulated rest hours, Olivia felt the familiar hum shift. It was subtle at first, like the faintest vibration under her feet, but it grew stronger, more insistent. Something was happening deep within the facility. A soft knock startled her. She turned, expecting one of the silent agents to appear, but no one entered. The knock came again, 3 taps, deliberate and slow. Olivia's heart raced as she approached the door. When she opened it, no one was there. Only a small slip of paper lay on the floor, its edges curling slightly, as though it had been folded for a long time. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. Beneath the mainframe, midnight, you're not alone. Her breath hitched. For the first time since she had been brought here, hope bloomed in the dark recesses of her mind. Someone else was fighting back. At 11:58 p.m., Olivia slipped into the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the polished floors. The cameras in this section were positioned high on the walls, their lenses sweeping back and forth in predictable arcs. She moved in their blind spots, her body tense with the fear of discovery. Each step felt like walking on the edge of a knife. The facility's lower levels were a maze of sterile corridors and locked doors. Olivia followed faint sounds, the distant hiss of vents, the occasional hum of an unseen machine, until she reached a staircase marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The air here was colder, the hum louder. As she descended, a strange static filled her ears, like 1,000 faint whispers overlapping. She tried to shake it off, but the sound grew louder the deeper she went, pressing against her skull like an unseen force. When she reached the bottom, she found herself in a cavernous room, bathed in a pale blue glow. The mainframe dominated the space, a towering structure of blinking lights and tangled wires that stretched to the ceiling. The whispers were louder here, a chorus of fragmented words that seemed to emanate from the machinery itself. "You came." Olivia whirled around, her heart pounding. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to drink in the dim light. Her face was familiar. Olivia had seen it in the faded photographs hanging in the dormitory halls, labeled only with a number. "Who are you?" Olivia whispered. The woman smiled faintly. "Someone who escaped. At least, part of me did." The cryptic reply sent a chill down Olivia's spine. The woman gestured toward the mainframe. "They're using you to fuel it. Your power, your mind, it's all part of the system. Every time you train, you give them more. If you stay, there won't be anything left of you." Olivia's legs felt like jelly, her stomach twisting. "How do I stop it?" The woman's expression darkened. "You can't stop it, but you can leave it behind." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They've built this place to keep us trapped, but they've overlooked one thing. The mainframe is powered by us. If you overload it, if you push your abilities beyond their limits, you can break the system long enough to escape." The idea terrified Olivia. She remembered the explosion in the testing room, the uncontrollable surge of energy that had left her trembling on the floor. But now, she had no choice. Olivia stepped into the heart of the room, her pulse quickening as she faced the mainframe. She could feel its pull, a relentless gravity tugging at her mind, whispering for her to surrender. But she wouldn't. Not tonight. Closing her eyes, she reached for the power within her, the force she had spent years suppressing. It surged forward, wild and untamed, a storm raging against the confines of her body. The room around her seemed to shudder, the hum of the mainframe turning into a frantic, high-pitched whine. Lights flickered, alarms blared. The whispers rose into a cacophony, an unintelligible scream that filled every corner of the facility. "Now!" the woman shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Olivia opened her eyes and released everything. The next thing she knew, she was running. The walls of the facility blurred around her, the alarms drowning out the sound of her own breath. Doors slid open as she approached, the systems failing in the wake of the overload. She didn't stop to think, didn't look back. The night air hit her like a slap, cold and sharp. She stumbled into the open, the facility's looming silhouette fading into the shadows behind her. For the first time in weeks, she felt free. But as she stood there, catching her breath, she noticed something. The air was still, the sky unnaturally clear. And faintly, just faintly, she heard the hum of the mainframe in the distance. Olivia knew the fight wasn't over. But for now, she was free.